Hi, I'm Lynda Downing, and this is my first module for AEP 880, which is our personal introduction in cultural diversity awareness. And all right, let's get started. So first, talk a little bit about myself, my personal information. My name is Lynda Marquette Downing. However, my birth given nickname is Marnie. I was born and raised and graduated from high school in Garden City, Kansas. I attended the University of South Dakota, where I achieved a BS in elementary education and special education. And I did attend the University of South Dakota on a swimming scholarship. My current hobbies are crocheting, reading, searching antique shops, vintage stores, and traveling. So my career. I just finished my 26th year as an educator. My first year was in Dodge City, Kansas as a special educator there at Northwest Elementary for kindergarten through 3rd grade. Then I moved to Lakin, Kansas, where I was a special educator for 5th through 6th grade for 3 years. Then got married and moved to Grinnell, Kansas, which is in north central Kansas, where I was a special educator for 1 year for kindergarten through 12th grade, which would be the whole district. Then we moved to a small town outside of Wichita, Kansas, and I was the 4th grade teacher there at Ingalls Edison Elementary, which is down on 9th and Grove. Then, unfortunately, we separated and divorced, and I moved to Arkansas City, Kansas. And yes, for those of you that are not from Kansas, in Kansas we pronounce it Arkansas, not Arkansas. I was a special educator there for 7th grade for 11 years, where I was also the department chair. I then moved back to Western Kansas, to Buckland, Kansas, to be closer to family. I'm the special educator here. I just finished my 8th year for 5th through 8th grade, which we consider junior high here in Buckland. I am the department chair for special education. I'm on the district leadership team and also on the SIT team, obviously, as a special educator. So let's talk a little bit about myself and my family. So my grandma story. This is my grandma right here and me when I was a little girl. My grandmother was an incredible person. She was born in 1904, which made her old enough to be my great-grandmother. She got married when she was 9. Let's start back just 1 second. She was born to a homesteader in Ness County, and she was the first of 8 children. So she was very much of a farmhand when she was a child. She had an 8th grade education, which was not rare in those days. She then got married to the dapper of the county when she was 19. She had my 2 uncles, my Uncle Dean and my Uncle Fred. Unfortunately, that marriage was rocky from the start. He struggled with alcohol and he could be physically abusive. My grandmother chose to leave him, which was a rare thing to do in those times, which would have been in the mid-30s. So my grandmother had lived during the Depression and during the Dust Bowl, in the heart of the Dust Bowl. She then moved to Lane County, where she met my grandfather, and they fell in love over a series of letters that were during World War II. When he returned, they were married. Her first husband had already passed away by then. The family is not sure if she got a formal divorce or not. We never really asked her that, I guess. So this is my grandparents, my grandmother, and my grandfather Austin. And so then she had my mother, she had my Aunt Nancy, and my mother. This is my Aunt Norma, who was married to my Uncle Dean. So my grandmother was an amazing person. All of her children did graduate from high school, and all of them attended college in some form. My Uncle Dean finished college and became a teacher. So we, as faith, we are Methodists. We come from a long line of Methodists, especially on my grandmother's side. Her maiden name was Ensign, and many of the Ensign family members, or men especially, became Methodist ministers. And this is my cousin Jerry here. He is also he is a Methodist minister at First United Methodist Church in Dodge City, Kansas. So adoptions. Adoptions are something that are very prevalent in my family and very important in my family. My first 3 cousins are adopted. So that would include my cousin Jerry. This is my cousin Beth, his sister. She is the first natural born cousin in our family, and my father was also adopted. So my ancestry, I'm 89% from Great Britain. I had that done through Ancestry a number of years ago. Genealogy was a large hobby of mine. So I'm 89%. So I'm English, Scottish, and Irish. The Scot and Irish definitely comes from my father. He also had his genealogy done, which he is, the majority of his ancestry comes from Scotland and Ireland. So if you're interested in looking at my particular family tree, you can look at Ancestry, which is under Downing Family Tree, number 1. So how did we get here? I do descend from a passenger on the Mayflower. That is William Brewster, and I'm also descended from his son, who came over on the Speedwell, which was a ship that came later. And also the majority of my grandmother's family line and my grandfather's, my grandparents here, came during the religious migration to the New England colonies and settled there. I am descended from a number of patriots, currently over a dozen. I'm also descended from a Salem witch trial victim, which was Rebecca Nurse, and a juror at her particular trial. How crazy is that? And I'm also descended from many Methodist ministers. So, Western immigration and the relay system. My family took advantage of that. They did a lot of that. I was obviously born or my family was born, usually had many, especially the ensigns, usually had many children. And so then on the farm, there wasn't enough room to support a new farm. So then they did what is called the relay system. And that's how we all ended up in Western Kansas, including my mother's family and my father's family. So like I said, that's how we ended up in Western Kansas, in Healy, which is a very small town in Lane, Kansas. That is where the majority of my mother's sides of the family are buried, in that cemetery there. My father's side of the family, they migrated to Deerfield and settled there, where both Healy and Deerfield, both sides of my family, did help prepare and build the Methodist churches that are there. And then we ended up in Garden City, Kansas. And that's mostly because of my Aunt Norma and my Uncle Dean. So let's talk about a few crazy traditions. I know, butter, how strange, right? Well, in my family, it is a tradition started from my grandmother and her family to butter your nose on your birthday. I know, very strange. So when I was small, my mother would wake me up and immediately my hand would go to my nose because I knew she would be trying to butter my nose. But the person that would always give me was my grandmother. So that's something that she did. It's something that came over. I think it's very much of a Scotch tradition. I'm not exactly sure. You'd have to Google it. And oyster soup. I put a can of oysters here because my family prefers canned oysters. One year, apparently, they tried regular oysters and they hated it. So here is my 10 photos to talk about myself. I love to crochet, so here is my crazy family, my aunts, and a few of my cousins, not all of them. And these are the gifts that I gave them one year. The women got scarves and the men got skull caps. Here's swimming. Swimming was a huge part of my life, especially when I was younger. And I chose a picture of someone doing the butterfly stroke because that was my stroke. So let's talk about Western Kansas. Western Kansas to me is beautiful. This is a picture of the Monument Rocks, is what some people call them. When I grew up, we called them the pyramids. Those are in Grove County, so if you ever get a chance to drive by and take a look, you really should. I love to travel. This is an Airbnb that my Aunt Nancy and I stayed at this summer in Kansas City. If you haven't done Airbnb, it's totally awesome. You should try it. So let's talk a little bit about my Aunt Nancy. Everybody in their life should have an Aunt Nancy. We just have always had a special connection ever since I was small. She has a daughter that's a month younger than I am, which we grew up like sisters. So this is a recent picture of my Aunt Nancy, and this is our newest addition to our family. This is Cutler, which is her great nephew, my cousin Jerry's grandson. So that's pretty exciting. We got to go and see them this summer in Kansas City. Now we'll flip over here to dyslexia. My family, many people in my family, not myself, but quite a few people in my family have dyslexia. I put, is it a family curse or superpower? I hope that we've turned it into a superpower. So a lot of us, not myself, but quite a few of my family members do have dyslexia, and we have determined that it does seem to be genetically run in the family. So the family business. My family are educators. They have been educators for generations, especially on my grandfather's side. I come from a line of educators, and pretty much everybody in my family, with the exception of a few, maybe one or two cousins, we are all educators. So I chose to go into special education for these two particular reasons. A lot of times my family have been diagnosed with dyslexia and have had an IEP, which can be very challenging. So I chose to go into special education. It just seemed what I was supposed to do. Now we'll move over here to Pyrex. I know it seems sort of strange, but I have a huge collector of Pyrex. Only this pattern, not all patterns. So I spent a lot of times with my Aunt Nancy looking in vintage shops and collecting Pyrex. It's just something I love to do. And lastly, we have my little dogs, Louie and Sugar. They're no longer with me, but they were a huge part of my life for years. They were my best friends. So now we'll talk about the first article that we were required to read, which was a collection of different articles that you could look at. So it's called Preparing for Cultural Diversity Resources for Teachers. So we have how can we prepare teachers to work with culturally diverse students and their families. This is useful because it has advice and useful tips on how to communicate with students and build relationships with their families. The second is also awareness activities, which is a collection of engaging ideas and activities to introduce diversity at the beginning of the school year. Then we have Teaching Diverse Learners, which is a resource to develop the capacity of teachers to work with English language learners. Then we have lesson plans and resources for multiculturalism and diversity. Scholastic is a scholastic collection of lesson plans and articles for educators to engage students and families of diverse backgrounds. And lastly, we have a resource library, which is for Inclusive Schools Network, which is a resource with a focus on creating equity for students with disabilities. The next one we were required to actually listen to, which was a video. So these are some points that I took from the video. We take 7 seconds to make an impression of others and to take in an impression of others. We use those impressions to make conclusions and determinations of others. Perspective. What we see on the outside doesn't always mirror what we see, and what we know about people are on the inside. Identity. Our adversities, triumphs, and tragedies, these things really make up our true identity of who we are. And policy. Why should a policy or a law disproportionately negatively affect these communities? And lastly, we don't walk our lives alone. I thought that was very poignant. It's past time to appreciate cultural diversity. So this was another video we were required to watch. People can make assumptions about me just based on how I look. Cultural diverse teams can produce more accurate work, develop new products, solve problems, and make decisions. We have the millennial generation is unlikely to crack the cultural ceiling. I found that very sad. We need authentic, unstrained conversations to look deep into the barriers that cultural minorities and their employers face. And lastly, there is a strength in our differences. Then the final video we were required to listen to or watch, the challenges of the cultural diversity. There are 1 billion immigrants in the world. Cultures can have very fundamental differences, and this can lead to stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Cultural diversity refers to many cultural, racial, and ethnic groups in a society. Implicit racism, negative behavior toward members of a particular cultural group that is covert and often unconscious or concealed. And lastly, a continued effort must be made if we are to address both racism, explicit and implicit, as one of the main challenges that cultural diversity presents. Then we go back to an article which is Engage Diverse Communities. Community engagement is an ongoing process which entails facilitating the participation of the community members, especially diverse or unrepresented groups. Different ethnic and racial groups might have varying definitions of community that manifest in distinctive culture, language, and kinship networks. Involving community members in the decision-making process moves the planning process from simply information and consulting with community members to including them in this process. Immigrants might experience language barriers that prevent them from engaging in community and public events. And lastly, participation should be understood as a means to increase democracy as well as a way of giving power or voice to communities that have been marginalized politically in the past. So, describe any familiar characteristics. My home state, Kansas, has been culturally diverse for generations. My hometown, Garden City, has been much studied for its cultural diversity. In fact, there was a study being conducted in my high school during my attendance. The question was, how do so many various cultures coexist with no violence? I'm pleased to say that my life has been enriched because of these experiences. My current community, Buckland, does not reflect the varied cultural diversity of the state, therefore neither does the schools. The biggest concern I have seen is implicit racism or bias as my years as a Kansan. The unseen or unspoken about an underlying racism which does exist in our communities. Our state school board, our legislator, our city councils, and our police departments are not a true representation of the cultural diversity of our population. Now the question is, how do we change that? Describe how you would apply the new knowledge you've gained. Currently, I'm a member of the district leadership team and the SIT team for Buckland School District. I will strive to address implicit racism bias as a member of those teams. The district leadership team makes many major decisions for Buckland School District. It is imperative those decisions be made with a clear head and an open heart. As a special educator, I will advocate for students with disabilities on a daily basis. I am lucky to work with a great bunch of teachers who are welcoming to all students. I wanted to include this quote here. We need to help our students and parents cherish and preserve the ethnic and cultural diversity that nourishes and strengthens this community and this nation. Cesar Chavez. So we'll talk about the standard and relevancy. So the standard. My assignment showed a direct correlation to the standard. By completing the video and research demonstrated my capacity to use data to evaluate and advocate for supportive and inclusive school culture. Relevancy. Completing my presentation has allowed me the opportunity to reflect on myself, my family, my hometown, my current community, and my state. I've always loved living in the High Plains. I love the vast open space it provides. Kansans are kind, generous, and industrious. We are willing to do the hard work. For generations, we have opened our communities and our doors to various cultures and people who need refuge. This makes me proud. Our communities have endeavored and continue to endeavor to educate all children. Reflection. Being born and raised in Western Kansas, I've experienced many different cultures. Western Kansas is surprisingly a very diverse place with many different cultures making up especially our large communities. Our small communities are varied and many have microcultures of their own. As a school leader, you must understand this. It is crucial to take the time to fully understand and appreciate the community you serve. As a future special education administrator, I will strive to advocate for students with disabilities who come from diverse backgrounds. Having a child with a disability is challenging, but having a child with a disability and coming from a diverse culture or background is especially challenging and can be overwhelming. I will endeavor to make the process less overwhelming and more meaningful by ensuring any communication is done in a parent's native language and in a language they can fully understand. So here's my takeaway for my presentation. Our ability to reach unity and diversity will be the beauty and the test of our civilization. Mahatma Gandhi. And here's my preferences. So thank you for taking the time to listen to my very lengthy video. I'm sorry that it was so long. Good luck in our class.